This story follows six friends who went camping in a quiet forest, looking for a weekend of freedom. They believed the night was normal, the fire dying and tents pitched under the stars. But when morning came, one of them was gone, without a trace. 12 years later, she was found barefoot on the same hill, silent, torn, and unrecognizable. Some places don't let you leave, and some bring you back broken. There were six of them: Mark, Daniel, Leo, Sarah, Nina, and Lena. They weren't reckless people. They weren't thrill seekers chasing danger. They were just young, tired of routines, and desperate for one weekend that felt like freedom again. College was behind them, jobs were starting to suffocate them, and this camping trip was supposed to be a pause before real life completely took over. The location had been Mark's idea: a quiet area near a stretch of forest and several hills that locals rarely talked about. Not because it was dangerous, just because, according to them, nothing ever happens there. No signal, no tourists, no noise. From the moment they arrived, something felt off. The air was heavy, unmoving. Even in the middle of the afternoon, the forest seemed muted, as if sound struggled to travel through it. When they laughed, the noise felt swallowed instead of echoed. They set up their tents in a loose circle. Lena hesitated before choosing hers, glancing toward the hills rising beyond the trees. She didn't say anything, but Sarah noticed. "You good?" Sarah asked. "Yeah," Lena replied quickly. "Just feels quiet." They brushed it off. As evening came, they built a fire. Flames danced, shadows stretched long and thin between the trees, and cards were spread out on a log they used as a table. Drinks were passed around. Laughter grew louder, forced almost, as if they were trying to fill the silence. That's when Mark stopped talking. "Did you hear that?" he asked. Everyone froze. "Hear what?" Daniel said. Mark frowned. "Someone talking, like whispering." They all listened. At first, nothing. Then, faintly, something drifted from the direction of the hills. It wasn't clear enough to understand, just a low murmur, rising and falling unnaturally. Sarah laughed. "You're freaking yourself out." "Sound travels weird in forests," Leo added. The explanation was accepted immediately. Too immediately. Lena said nothing. She stared into the fire, her jaw tight, her fingers gripping her drink harder than necessary. Later, as the fire burned low, Nina spoke quietly. "It kinda sounds like it's saying something." Daniel snapped, "Stop!" That ended the conversation. They went to sleep soon after, each retreating into their tents, convincing themselves that daylight would make everything normal again. Lena lay awake longer than the others. The forest was silent again, but not peaceful. And just as her eyes finally began to close, she heard it, right outside her tent, a whisper. Lena woke suddenly, not from a sound but from a feeling, the sharp and immediate sense that she was no longer alone. Her eyes opened to darkness inside the tent, the thin fabric barely separating her from the forest outside, and for a few seconds she lay completely still, listening to her own breathing and the slow pounding of her heart. The fire had long since died, and the campsite that had felt warm and familiar hours earlier now seemed distant, unreal, like something remembered rather than present. The air inside the tent felt colder than it should have been, heavy in a way that made each breath feel deliberate. She checked her phone, the screen lighting up the space just enough to remind her where she was. No signal. 2:17 a.m. She told herself she had probably heard an animal or a branch snapping in the distance, that her mind was still half dreaming, but before she could fully convince herself, she heard it again. A whisper. Soft, slow, stretched unnaturally, as if the sound itself had been pulled thin. It wasn't loud enough to be threatening, but it was close enough to be intimate, and that terrified her more than shouting ever could. The voice didn't say her name, yet she felt a deep certainty that it was meant for her alone. She held her breath, straining to listen, her body tense as the whisper faded and returned in uneven waves, sometimes from the left, sometimes from the right, sometimes from directly in front of her tent. When she finally whispered Mark's name, her voice came out so quiet she barely heard it herself, and the forest offered no response. The whispering stopped abruptly, plunging everything into an even heavier silence that pressed against her ears until it almost hurt. That was when she heard movement. Slow footsteps, deliberate and unhurried, circling the tent in a wide arc. They were too measured to belong to an animal, and too light to sound like someone stumbling in the dark. Whoever or whatever was moving outside seemed to know exactly where it was going. Lena sat up, her hands clenched in the fabric of her sleeping bag, her mind racing through explanations she didn't believe. She told herself it had to be one of her friends playing a joke, though she couldn't imagine why anyone would choose this moment or this tone. The footsteps stopped directly in front of her. A shadow blocked what little moonlight filtered through the tent wall, tall and narrow, unnaturally still. Something brushed against the fabric, not pushing, not pulling, just resting there as if testing the boundary between inside and outside. The whisper returned, closer now, layered, overlapping, as though several voices were speaking at once but sharing the same breath. Lena's fear shifted into something colder, something heavier, the kind of fear that comes with certainty rather than surprise. She felt an overwhelming pressure behind her eyes, a sensation that wasn't a command but an expectation, a quiet insistence that she was supposed to do something. She doesn't remember deciding to unzip the tent. She doesn't remember standing up or stepping onto the cold ground barefoot. What she remembers, fragmented and incomplete, is the feeling that if she stayed, something terrible would happen to the others. The idea settled into her mind fully formed, unquestionable, like a memory instead of a thought. The forest seemed to open for her as she walked, shadows pulling back just enough to reveal a narrow path leading toward the hills. The whispers guided her without urgency, drifting ahead of her, behind her, around her, never rushing, never stopping. She felt detached from her body, aware of her feet touching the ground but disconnected from the sensation of pain or cold. Time lost its shape. The stars above looked wrong, stretched and distant, and the air grew thicker with every step she took away from the campsite. By the time she reached the base of the hill, she felt hollow, emptied of everything except the need to keep moving. What happened next never returned to her in full, not in dreams, not in therapy, not even in flashes. There was no single moment of terror she could point to, no clear image of being taken or attacked. Just a sensation of crossing a boundary she hadn't known existed, of stepping somewhere she was never meant to be and realizing too late that turning back was no longer an option. Morning came quietly to the campsite she left behind. Mark woke first, and breathing in the cold air, unaware that anything was wrong. Sarah emerged from her tent complaining about her back, and Nina started heating water like she always did. It wasn't until Daniel asked where Lena was that the first crack appeared in the normalcy of the morning. Her tent was still zipped from the inside, her sleeping bag untouched, her clothes neatly folded as if she had planned to return. Her phone lay near the fire pit, the screen cracked, the battery dead. Her shoes were gone. Panic spread fast, voices overlapping now in a way that echoed the whispers from the night before. They searched the surrounding area frantically, shouting her name, running through the trees, calling out until their throats hurt. There were no footprints leading away from camp, no disturbed soil, no broken branches, nothing to suggest she had walked anywhere at all. When the police arrived, the forest felt different again, heavier, watchful, as if something unseen had settled back into place now that what it wanted was gone. The investigation lasted months, then years, but it never truly moved forward. From the very beginning, the police treated Lena's disappearance as something that should have left evidence, and when it didn't, they quietly shifted the case into the category of things that simply don't make sense. Search dogs tracked her scent in a straight line from the campsite toward the hills, stopping abruptly near a cluster of rocks where the ground hardened and the vegetation thinned. No circling, no confusion, no continuation, just an ending. Officers checked ravines, caves, tree lines, and even brought in specialists to examine the soil, convinced at first that she had fallen into some hidden opening. Nothing was found. Not a thread of clothing, not a trace of blood, not even a broken branch. It was as if Lena had been erased between one step and the next. The friends were questioned separately, over and over again, their answers recorded, compared, analyzed. Every interview eventually circled back to the same detail they all tried to minimize: the voices. Investigators noticed how each of them reacted differently when the subject came up. Mark became defensive, insisting it was just imagination. Sarah cried and apologized repeatedly, as if she had done something wrong by surviving. Nina trembled so badly during one interview that it had to be paused. Daniel shut down completely, answering in short, clipped sentences. Leo laughed at inappropriate moments, his eyes never quite focusing on the person in front of him. None of them said it outright, but all of them shared the same unspoken fear that the voices hadn't been random, that they had been intentional. After the case went cold, life forced itself forward in uncomfortable ways. Jobs were taken, relationships formed and failed, cities changed. On the surface, they looked like people who had moved on, but beneath that surface, the night Lena vanished followed them everywhere. Mark couldn't stand silence anymore. He slept with a fan running year-round, a television playing quietly in the background, anything to drown out the possibility of hearing something else. Daniel developed a habit of checking locks and windows repeatedly, especially at night, even when he lived on higher floors where no one could realistically reach him. Nina began seeing a therapist for anxiety, though she never fully explained the reason. She avoided forests entirely, refused hiking invitations, and once had a panic attack simply from hearing wind pass through tall grass. Sarah moved the farthest away, physically and emotionally, but even distance didn't save her. She dreamed of Lena standing just outside her bedroom door, whispering softly, patiently, waiting for Sarah to answer. Leo pretended he was fine the longest, drowning the discomfort in parties and noise, but even he started waking up at night, convinced he heard someone speaking directly into his ear. What made everything worse was that the area around the campsite never truly went quiet. Over the years, hikers and locals occasionally reported strange sounds near the hills. Some described whispers carried on the wind. Others claimed they heard murmuring when the air was completely still. A few recorded audio on their phones, capturing faint, distorted noises that sounded almost like overlapping voices trying to form words. Authorities dismissed these reports as environmental noise, wind through rock formations, or psychological suggestion fueled by old rumors about the missing girl. Still, something about the recordings unsettled the people who listened closely. The sounds weren't random, they repeated. Certain patterns emerged, rhythms that didn't match nature. And every now and then, one phrase seemed almost recognizable, though never clear enough to transcribe. On the 10th anniversary of Lena's disappearance, Mark returned to the area alone, driven by a mix of guilt and obsession. He stood at the edge of the hill where the dogs had lost her scent and listened. For a long time, there was nothing. Then, just as he was about to leave, he heard it. A whisper, low and drawn out, coming from multiple directions at once. He didn't stay long enough to hear more. 2 years later, Lena was officially presumed dead. The announcement should have brought closure, but instead it created a different kind of fear, one that none of them could fully articulate. Because deep down, every single one of them knew the same thing. Whatever happened to Lena that night had not ended. For years after Lena was declared legally dead, the area around the hills remained officially open, but people stopped going there, without ever agreeing to stop. It happened slowly, through rumors rather than warnings, through stories passed quietly between hikers and locals who had learned to trust instinct over explanation. Those who did venture near the old campsite often described the same sensation before anything strange occurred, a sudden heaviness in the air, a feeling that sound didn't behave the way it should, that voices carried too far or not far enough. At first, reports were vague and easily dismissed. A man claimed he heard someone whispering his name while resting near the base of the hill, only to realize he was completely alone. A couple hiking at dusk recorded what they thought was wind moving through rocks, but when they played the audio back later, the sound repeated in a steady rhythm, rising and falling like breathing. Authorities labeled it environmental noise, psychological suggestion, or misinterpretation fueled by the lingering story of the missing girl. But the reports didn't stop. They became more specific, more consistent. People began describing that seemed to respond when spoken to, growing clearer when acknowledged and fading when ignored. A park ranger quietly admitted to a colleague that during a routine patrol, he heard murmuring directly behind him and turned around expecting to see someone standing there, only to find empty ground and the sensation that whatever had been close had stepped away at the last possible second. Audio recordings started circulating online, low-quality clips uploaded by people who didn't fully understand what they had captured. In several of them, investigators later noticed something deeply unsettling. The whispers were not random. They followed paths. The sound moved from left to right, from foreground to background, as if tracing a route across the land. When enhanced, some recordings even appeared to contain pauses, moments of silence placed exactly where a person might stop walking. This was the first time the hills drew official attention again. The area was surveyed, equipment placed discreetly to monitor sound and movement, though publicly it was framed as routine environmental research. Over weeks of recording, a pattern emerged that no one could comfortably explain. The whispers were most active between 2 and 3 in the morning, strongest near the same cluster of rocks where search dogs had lost Lena's scent 12 years earlier. And on certain nights, when the air was especially still, the recordings captured something else layered beneath the murmurs. Footsteps, slow, bare, moving uphill. These findings were never released to the public, but among those reviewing the data, an unspoken tension began to grow. Someone asked, quietly, whether it was possible the sounds were being made by a person living undetected in the area. That theory fell apart quickly. No signs of shelter were found, no consistent food sources, no evidence of long-term human presence. The whispers didn't behave like a living person either. They appeared and disappeared abruptly, sometimes overlapping in ways that suggested more than one source speaking at once. The investigation stalled again, pushed aside as resources were redirected elsewhere. But something had changed. The hills no longer felt dormant. And then, late one afternoon, a call came in that didn't fit the pattern of the others. A teenage boy hiking alone had reported finding a woman near the top of the hill, barefoot, disoriented, and unable to speak. At first, responders assumed it was another case of someone getting lost or experiencing a mental health crisis, but the coordinates he gave matched the area of highest recorded whisper activity exactly. When officers arrived, they felt it immediately. The same pressure in the air noted in earlier reports, the same unnatural quiet that swallowed the sound of their approach. The woman stood where the boy had said she would be, facing the tree line, her posture rigid, as if she were listening to something just out of reach. Her clothes were not modern hiking gear or casual clothing, but garments that looked worn down by time rather than terrain, fabric thinned, seams weakened, dirt ground deep into every fold. She did not turn when they spoke to her. She did not react to raised voices or movement. Only when one officer stepped slightly too close did she flinch, a sharp, involuntary reaction that suggested fear rather than confusion. They asked her name. No response. They asked where she had come from. Her lips parted slightly, but no sound followed. As they guided her away from the hill, one officer later reported feeling an overwhelming urge to look back, a sense that something behind them was watching the space she had occupied with unmistakable attention. At the station, standard procedures followed: fingerprints taken, photographs recorded, medical staff called in. It was routine until it wasn't. When the missing persons database returned a match, the room went quiet in a way that felt too familiar to anyone who had studied Lena's file years earlier. The woman's face on the screen matched perfectly with a photograph taken 12 years ago, down to the smallest details. No aging, no visible passage of time. Lena. The girl who had vanished without a trace had been found exactly where the land itself seemed to end her trail. When word reached the remaining members of the friend group, disbelief came first, followed by something colder. Because none of them asked the question that should have mattered most. None of them asked where she had been. The only thing they wanted to know was why she was back now. Lena did not speak during the first days after she was found, and at first no one found that unusual given her condition. Trauma, doctors said, can shut people down in ways that look deliberate from the outside, but are entirely beyond their control. She complied with every instruction without resistance, allowed herself to be examined, fed, washed, dressed in clean hospital clothes. Yet there was an unmistakable absence behind her eyes, as if she were present only because something was keeping her there. She slept in short intervals and woke abruptly, sitting upright in bed, her gaze fixed on the far corner of the room where the light never fully reached. Nurses noted that she reacted strongly to silence, growing visibly tense when the room was quiet for too long, and seemed calmer when soft, constant noise filled the space. A fan was placed in her room, then a low radio, not for comfort but necessity. When social workers attempted to ask her basic questions, her name, her age, the year it was, she either did not respond or reacted with physical distress, her breathing quickening, her hands clenching until her knuckles went white. It became clear that pushing her for answers would do more harm than good. A trauma specialist was assigned, someone experienced in dissociation and long-term psychological shock. And even then the approach was slow, careful, almost hesitant, as if everyone involved sensed that whatever Lena had experienced did not fit neatly into known categories. During the first therapy sessions, the therapist avoided direct questions about the disappearance entirely. Instead, she focused on grounding, on the present, on reinforcing the idea that Lena was safe and no longer alone. At first, Lena responded only with nods or small physical gestures, her voice absent but her attention sharp. Over time, however, brief words began to surface, simple responses. Yes. No. Sometimes, I don't know. Spoken so quietly it was nearly lost. The therapist noted that Lena seemed to struggle, not with speaking itself, but with deciding which thoughts were allowed to leave her. It wasn't until the fourth session that something shifted. The therapist asked whether Lena remembered anything familiar, not the night she vanished, but something ordinary from before. Lena paused for a long time, then said, haltingly, that she remembered warmth, firelight, the sound of wood settling and cracking. At the mention of the campsite, her body reacted before her mind could correct itself. Her shoulders tensed, her breathing shortened, and her eyes moved instinctively toward the door. I shouldn't, she whispered, the words barely formed. When asked what she meant, Lena shook her head, distress rising quickly. Her hands trembled, and the sound that escaped her throat slipped away from language, falling back into that low, uneven hum. Staff prepared to intervene, but the therapist stopped them again, sensing that something important was happening. The sound Lena made rose and fell in a pattern that felt deliberate. When the therapist listened closely, she realized Lena wasn't expressing emotion. She was repeating something she had learned. When the session recordings were later reviewed and enhanced, the realization became impossible to ignore. Lena's vocalizations were not random. They followed a structure. Pauses placed precisely. Emphasis repeating at exact intervals. When compared to audio collected near the hills over the years, the match was unmistakable. Lena wasn't mimicking the whispers. She knew them. After that, the approach shifted. Questions were reduced. Listening became the priority. Slowly, fragments of memory surfaced. Lena spoke in short, disconnected statements, often unsure whether what she remembered belonged to the past or the present. She said there had been more voices than she could count, but they didn't all speak at once. She said they waited. She said the hill felt open, like something unfinished. When asked where she had been for 12 years, she grew confused, insisting that it hadn't felt like years at all. Sometimes she said she had been gone a little while. Other times she said too long, without explaining further. There were gaps she could not cross. Entire stretches of time she seemed unable to even approach mentally. When the therapist tried to guide her toward those missing pieces, Lena became frightened, insisting that remembering certain things would start it again. She never clarified what it was. One session ended abruptly when Lena said, without prompting, "I stayed because someone had to." When asked who, she went silent and refused to speak for the rest of the day. During an art exercise, Lena filled the page with lines moving upward, converging at a single point near the top. She circled that point repeatedly until the paper tore beneath the pressure. Beneath the drawing, she wrote a single word, the clearest she had written since returning. Waiting. Lena remains in therapy. She eats, sleeps, and follows routines, and on paper, her recovery appears steady. She speaks more now, though never for long, and never without choosing her words carefully. She avoids specifics, especially about time and place, and when pressed, she admits there are parts of her memory that feel sealed, not forgotten, but inaccessible. Those who spend time with her notice the same tension behind her eyes, a constant awareness, a sense that she is listening, even when nothing is being said. Sometimes she, under her breath, or, short phrases she later claims not to remember saying. The rhythms match the recordings from the hills exactly. Occasionally, staff report faint sounds outside her room late at night, too soft to identify, rising and fading without a clear source. Lena never acknowledges them, but she sleeps better on those nights, as if reassured. She has not described the full truth of what happened on the hill, and it remains unclear whether she ever will. The friends who last saw her alive remember a girl who belonged to the world easily, and a woman who returned carrying something unseen but heavy. Officially, the hills remain closed. Unofficially, recordings still capture patterns. Pauses that resemble footsteps and breath. Sounds that respond when acknowledged. Sounds that wait. Lena lives suspended between two realities, the life she left behind and the role she seems unable to abandon. Whatever claimed her for 12 years did not release her entirely, and until the day Lena chooses to say everything she knows, the hills will continue to listen, patient and aware, holding their silence like a promise.